Hello and welcome back to another episode of the Grace Lutheran Podcast. This is Pastor Matt Nupel, and I'm so glad that you tuned into our program today as we discuss different issues and topics about our faith and lives in Jesus Christ. And as always, if you are in the Winston-Salem area looking for a church that offers traditional Christ-centered worship and is able to accommodate different concerns about social distancing, you are always invited to join us every Sunday morning at 10 a.m. at the Hayworth Miller Chapel in Advance. Before we begin today's topic, it would be difficult for me to ignore the events that took place yesterday on Capitol Hill. As the church, there is a sense where we're called to be in the world, but not of the world. Yet at the same time, I believe it should always be a matter of concern to us when we see the level of political unrest in our nation that we witnessed last night, especially when it results in a loss of life. While much of the violence and unrest last night was perpetuated by a specific political view, I don't believe it's as simple as just blaming the people that were involved in the violent protest last night. Instead, I believe the events of last night were the culmination of years of division and hostility and prejudice against one another based on our political views. Last night is the unfortunate result of a culture that continues to perpetuate the idea that we cannot peacefully coexist with those who share different political views than our own. The only way that we can start to effect change in our country and to heal the division that we currently see is to begin with ourselves. How do we treat those in our own lives who vote differently than we do? What do we say about those who disagree with us politically on social media? Yesterday's events were definitely shocking, but we can't sit and wonder too long why yesterday's events would happen after years of it being socially acceptable to treat those stupid conservatives or those dumb liberals, whichever side of the political spectrum we fall on. It's become socially acceptable to treat them on a public level however we want to. So church, as we navigate throughout the days ahead as to how to best respond to the kind of political unrest that we see, I would encourage us to begin by avoiding much of the political prejudice and the hateful rhetoric that has become acceptable in many social circles today. With that being said, why don't we move on to today's topic, which is something much more upbeat, something that we all probably need more of today. And that is the topic of this special feast day we call Epiphany. I find Epiphany's placement on the church year calendar to be pretty unfortunate because it oftentimes gets overlooked or skipped because most people are too exhausted to celebrate it after all of the excitement from Christmas, from New Year's, from the Feast of the Circumcision of Jesus. While Epiphany has unfortunately taken a back seat throughout church history, it is considered one of the major feast days throughout the church year. But I hope this episode encourages our listeners in the years ahead to keep up the holiday momentum just a little bit longer to include Epiphany within your celebration. So this feast that we call Epiphany goes by two common names. In the West, we often call it Epiphany, but in the Eastern churches, it's common to call it the Feast of the Theophany, which is a Greek word that means the appearing of God. But here in the West, we've kept this name Epiphany, which comes from the Greek word epiphaneia, meaning manifestation, to emphasize a different aspect of this liturgical season. In many ancient Western cultures, when a king or a prince or someone in high authority came to visit a small village or a very insignificant part of their kingdom, this was often called by the inhabitants of that town an epiphany. If you can imagine, in the ancient world, if you were the king of a really big kingdom, there may be parts of your empire that you don't even see throughout your entire reign. So if you were a peasant living out in the hills of a kingdom somewhere, it would be a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to have the king come and visit you. In the second chapter of John's Gospel, we're told that Jesus manifested his glory in Cana. And the word used for manifested comes from this Greek word epiphaneia. So in the Gospels, we see this theme of Jesus coming into the world and manifesting his glory in much the same way A king comes into a shabby town in his kingdom, manifesting his glory. In the West, this is the central theme that carries our celebration of Epiphany, that Jesus Christ, our King, has manifested himself to us, his subjects. While the meaning and significance of Epiphany seems pretty straightforward, unfortunately, the history behind this holiday isn't so much. The earliest celebration of Epiphany that we can find is in 353 AD in a church in Milan. But what's interesting is that they're not celebrating these previous aspects of Epiphany that we've been talking about. Instead, they were celebrating the Nativity of Jesus Christ, or Christmas. As I briefly mentioned in our Christmas episode, there was a bit of debate in the early church as to when Christmas should be celebrated on the church calendar. And besides the eventually agreed upon date of December 25th, another proposed date was January 6th. So interestingly, Epiphany began as an alternate celebration of Christmas in certain parts of the Roman Empire. But after the date December 25th is officially chosen and solidified and makes a widespread impact on the Roman Empire, the celebration on January 6th was kept, but it transitioned to a different specific aspect of the Nativity, and that is the adoration of the Magi. In the Gospel of Matthew, after the birth story of Jesus Christ, we get another story about these Magi, or wise men, coming from the east to seek out and worship the newborn Jesus. Now, there's a lot of mystery and confusion around these characters that we call the Magi. For instance, in the actual story, we're never told that there were three of them. In art, it's common to portray them in three because of the three gifts that they bring to the child Jesus. But we don't know how many of them there were. And we also know that they most likely weren't royalty, as they're often portrayed in nativity scenes. Instead, we can picture the Magi as being part of some royal court or under some royal authority in the capacity of gaining or revealing knowledge. In other words, we can imagine the Magi most likely consisted of people such as teachers or scientists or astronomers or even those who deal with alchemy or potions. This word Magi could mean a lot of different things depending on what kingdom they were coming from, but we know they likely held the occupation of teaching a king or a queen or someone in royal authority about the natural world. This is why we often translate them to wise men in English. So because it's such a short story, I thought it'd be worth reading the narrative of the Magi in the Gospel of Matthew. You can follow along with me beginning at chapter 2. Now after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea in the days of Herod the king, behold, wise men from the east came to Jerusalem, saying, "Where is he who has been born King of the Jews? For we saw his star when it rose and have come to worship him." When Herod the king heard this, he was troubled, and all Jerusalem with him. And assembling all the chief priests and scribes of the people, he inquired of them where the Christ was to be born. They told him, "In Bethlehem of Judea. For so it is written by the prophet, 'And you, O Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah. For from you shall come a ruler who will shepherd my people Israel.'" Then Herod summoned the wise men secretly, and ascertained from them what time the star had appeared. And he sent them to Bethlehem, saying, "Go and search diligently for the child, and when you have found him, bring me word that I too may come and worship him." After listening to the king, they went on their way, and behold, the star that they had seen when it rose went before them until it came to rest over the place where the child was. When they saw the star, they rejoiced exceedingly with great joy. And going into the house, they saw the child with Mary, his mother, and they fell down and worshipped him. Then, opening their treasures, they offered him gifts, gold and frankincense and myrrh. And being warned in a dream not to return to Herod, they departed to their own country by another way. Now, I assume our listeners have heard this story at some point or another, and if you grew up in the church, you've heard this story at least once a year for your entire life. But because of this, I find there's a lot of strangeness in this story that we often overlook because we've heard it on repeat so many times. The first thing to notice is, why are these Eastern Gentiles coming to Israel to worship a Jewish Messiah that they're so certain has been born? The only answer that we can provide to this question is that somehow the star that they see in the sky was a fulfillment of some tradition or some prophecy or something that was part of their culture that told them that this was an important and miraculous event. It's possible these magi had access to ancient Hebrew literature, especially in the Old Testament, that points to the Messiah and his birth being signified by a star in the sky. Some scholars have even suggested that these magi had access to the book of Numbers, and when they read chapter 24 that says that a star shall come out of Jacob, that they understood that this was a sign of the birth of the Messiah. Yet at the same time, I can't help but get the sense that this confusion or this mixture between Jew and Gentile, or between this prophecy of Israel and the way of understanding the world that comes out of the East, these two things coming together in this story is really what the story is all about. The fact that God's word does not return to him empty, even when it goes out into the Gentile world apart from Israel. So in the arrival of the Magi, we see this beautiful testimony of how God's word has extended to the far corners of the ancient world and has touched and impacted the lives of people so far removed from Israel that it has brought them into God's presence in the person of Jesus Christ. When we get to the reaction of King Herod, the first thing to point out is, notice how Herod does everything in secrecy. Nothing he does from here on out is done in public, but first he gathers the chief priests and scribes in this private, exclusive meeting, and then he meets with these wise men in a private, exclusive meeting. Nothing Herod does in this story is public. Everything he does is in secrecy and in the cover of darkness. Now this tells us as the readers that Herod is likely up to no good. But it's also an important contrast to notice Herod's dealings as king versus Christ's dealings as our true king. How Christ's activity is often done publicly, and his resurrection is proclaimed in a way that includes all nations. The bright, shining public light of Bethlehem that illumines the path of the wise men serves as an important foil to the darkness and the secrecy that Herod continues to perpetuate in this story. And I love how Matthew makes mention of the fact that when the wise men saw the place that they had been looking for, that they were overjoyed exceedingly with great joy, almost as if the Greek language couldn't even express the amount of joy that they experienced in that moment, that their long journey of searching for the Messiah had come to an end, and that they had found the Lord Christ. We read that they immediately begin worshiping the child Jesus, and we also read that they offer him 3 specific gifts: gold, frankincense, and myrrh. Each of these 3 gifts have been understood to signify a particular aspect of Jesus Christ and his arrival into our world. The first 2 gifts, gold and frankincense, are the fulfillment of a prophecy that we read in Isaiah chapter 60. At verse 6 we read, "A multitude of camels shall cover you, the young camels of Midian and Ephah. All those from Sheba shall come. They shall bring gold and frankincense, and shall bring good news, the praises of the Lord." This verse in Isaiah is also a reason why we often see the wise men riding camels in many artistic depictions or nativity sets, because the arrival of the wise men to Jesus is seen as a fulfillment of this prophecy in Isaiah 60. Throughout the history of the church, it's been commonly understood that the gift of gold is meant to signify the royalty of Jesus Christ, how Christ is truly our King who has come into the world and deserves royal patronage through this gift of gold. The next gift, frankincense, has been commonly understood to signify Christ's identity as our high priest. Burning incense within worship was common in the ancient world, and the Jewish people were no exception. God desired that his people burn incense in the temple as a testimony of the prayers of the people rising before his heavenly throne. As the psalmist says, "Let my prayer rise before you as incense." So the offering of incense to Christ is seen as a fulfillment of Christ's vocation as priest. But then we get to the third gift, and this gift isn't mentioned in Isaiah chapter 60, but we read that the wise men offer the gift of myrrh to the baby Jesus. Now, in the ancient world, myrrh was this substance that was usually created with a mix of oil and different sweet-smelling spices to improve the odor of a specific thing or location. In many cases, myrrh was used for the embalming of dead bodies. Because of this, it's been understood that the gift of myrrh serves as a foreshadowing of the eventual death that Christ must suffer for the sins of the whole world. While I definitely believe the gift of myrrh carries with it this significance, I believe there's another foreshadowing of this gift of myrrh. And it's actually a very biblical theme if we look at an often forgotten book of the Bible called the Song of Solomon. Interestingly, it's in the Song of Solomon that we see the most references to this substance, myrrh. In chapter 5 of the Song of Solomon, we read about the bride waiting for her beloved, and as she waits for his arrival, she adorns her body with liquid myrrh. This was another common use for myrrh in the ancient world, especially for those who were wealthy, to adorn their bed or whatever furniture they had in their house with this myrrh to make it smell better. Later on in the same chapter, the bride describes her beloved as having lips dripping with myrrh, meaning that what comes out of his mouth is as sweet as the smell of myrrh. So on one hand, we can see this gift of myrrh as a foreshadowing of Christ's embalmment after he's been crucified. But on the other hand, we can see this gift of myrrh as another type of foreshadowing that tells us that in the arrival of Christ, our beloved has come to claim his bride, the church. And from his lips will come the sweetness of the gospel, the good news unto the salvation of all people, both Jew and Gentile. This is the central message of Epiphany that we celebrate during this liturgical season, that the good news that is brought first to the Jews has also extended to the Gentiles, and that those from these Eastern countries have come to worship the baby Jesus and claim him as their Lord and Savior too. As we continue to observe this short season in the church year calendar, may we celebrate the reality and the truth that our King has come to manifest himself in full glory to his people during a time where it may be difficult to put our trust or our hope in our civil leaders. We can rightly thank God that we are members of a greater kingdom, and that we've been claimed as citizens of this kingdom by the love of God revealed to us in the death and resurrection of his Son, Jesus Christ. That will be all the time we have for today. Thank you again for tuning into our program. This will be the end of our holiday-themed episodes for a while. So as always, we're taking suggestions or recommendations of topics that you'd like discussed on the program. But until then, we hope you have a blessed Epiphany. Take care, and God bless.